Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And this is the second part of our conversation with Johannes Paavola talking about prep in RPGs.
And I think it's only part of the prep for your sandbox variety of gaming where I ran that started with a number game some time back, and that game has you generate a sector of space with random dice rolls from the book, but it doesn't give you all the super nitty-gritty details you might want for the game itself, even though it's pretty good for that as well. But let's say in general you roll a planet, you figure out that, it's a tyranny, there's a tyrannical planetary despot, and also heavy mining. So those two things would be the things that you have on your little notebook. And then once you figure out, my players are going there, you sort of you look at that, very broad strokes, some kind of tyrant, some kind of mining, and then you, once it becomes apparent that you need more detail, you go back and then you add the detail in. And the good thing with that is, of course, you don't need to do all the detail stuff for all your sandbox map at once to start with, because as John was saying, the front loading is quite a bit to handle without going into extreme detail for every single part of it. But it also allows you to tailor the thing for your specific needs at the time. So your idea for a tyrannical mining planet might have been very different without the context of whatever the players had done before. So you can sort of use what has happened before to fill in the future prep that you do much more easily when let's say, this probably applies to other games as well, but at least for Sandbox, this is what came very handy for me. Sort of taking in the things that are of interest to the party and putting them forward into other spaces that hadn't been defined yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I used the same table as from Stars Without Number for the White Star campaign that I'm running you guys through at the minute, because the tables themselves, which is one of the reasons I like all of the sort of toolkit stuff in Kevin Crawford's work. They're pretty much system agnostic, the actual sort of sandbox toolkits. So I was like, right, okay, Stars Without Number, it's a sci-fi game. It's a sci-fi toolkit for generating your hex scroll. Right, I'll take that out and I'll just use it for my White Star game. And I use the Sectors Without Number website, where you can literally just click a button and it's boom, there's a hex map of your system. You click on the star systems that it's populated, and it gives you that sort of surface level detail. And as with most sort of hex scrolls, I don't zoom down to the sort of the nth degree up until the point it becomes necessary, as you were saying, Johannes. So both in the Old School Essentials campaign and the White Star campaign, I've got in this hex there's a precious mineral, to use a recent example from the OSE campaign. But until your guy sort of expressed an interest in it, I was like, I just know there's a precious mineral in that area of the mountains. Then when you sort of start looking into it, I was like, right, okay, I'll work out exactly what it is. Oh yeah, there's an old settler who's discovered mithril in the mountains, and there's a bit of a sort of gold rush going on, and then you can develop that more. So although you do sort of front load your prep in hex crawls, you only do it to a certain degree. You don't have to drill down to that sort of umpteenth level. But it just meant that when you guys are we're going to go to the mountains, I was like, right, I know there's some sort of precious material there, and then I can develop it further rather than me just having to come up with everything entirely off the cuff. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this earlier on, but would you guys say that your prep style is different depending on what game you're running? And if so, how?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And a lot of it, to start with, I'll look at what the game is telling me about that kind of thing. And I like to play a whole bunch of different kind of games, as we know, from, I suppose, season 1 of the podcast. But I aim to prep in the way that the game that I'm trying to run would benefit most from. A lot of the times, at least in some of the more recent publications, that's probably at least a very good version of that can be found in the game materials itself. The book might just give you all the good ideas for how to prep, or it might just have tools for you to generate the prep in question from the book itself. As we were playing Scum and Villainy, the sort of serial numbers filed off Star Wars game some months back. It has a very good just nested table system of generating missions for you to go on adventures, and so that's what I did. That's what I used. But for Stars with a Number, to contrast with another sci-fi game of similar sort of general framework, with very different tools, the prep generation tools in Stars Without Number are mostly for world building, even though there's a little bit for this is the kind of adventures you could go on to, but a lot of it is to do with the world in general. So for that, I would just make it out of whole cloth based on the world generation bits that I had done with the book material itself. Of course, sometimes you just do you. Sometimes you just do whatever you need to at the time, regardless of whatever the game is. But for most of the time, I try to at least try what the game is saying. This is probably what you should do.
So how about you then, love? Did your style of prep vary depending on what sort of game you're running?
Not particularly, I don't think. The types of props that I spend far too much time on tend to vary depending on the game. But
now, would you say that's because you always tend to run lighter sort of rules games or similar style games?
Yeah. I don't really care all that much about the mechanics.
Yeah.
And I'll try and make a couple of notes for any mechanics that I'm likely to need, or have like a monster book on hand to get whatever mechanics I'm going to need. But I'm far more interested in the story than which numbers add up to what.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I'm sort of prepping, it very much does depend on the type of game I run. Like I said, I mostly run these sort of open world, sort of exploration style games. So I've got loads of books that are like random table books for like fantasy and other sort of genres. And obviously online, there's loads of different blogs and random generators online. But like the other day when I was doing a bit of prep for my Old School Essentials game, and I was uploading YouTube videos at the time, so that had sucked up all my bandwidth, so I basically couldn't use the internet. I was just able to like just grab a couple of books off the shelf that have got random tables in, like the Table Fables books, and just flip through them to get some ideas. And whether it's just like rolling for an NPC name or something like that, I do like having the books, because it means I've not got access to the internet or whatever. I've still got all these resources I can potentially pull on for inspiration. But I do think my prep varies depending on what game we're in. Like I said, I mostly run these open world games, but when I was running the 5th edition Vampire game, my prep for that was quite different in a way to my prep for like OSE, because that's set in ostensibly the real world, set in London. So a lot of my prep was just like browsing like Wikipedia pages or books that are connected with London, looking at things from the history of it, looking for anything that jumped out where I thought, oh, that could be interesting to bring into the game. But as well, sort of having had the sessions in, around knowing what sort of things the players wanted to do and what the characters are interested in, anything where I looked through, like your character being slightly more involved in like the necromantic sort of line of things, Johannes, looking through, maybe I'd see like a fact in a book or online about like the oldest graveyard in London or something like that, and I'd be like, all right, that could be something that could come up in the future. So I think, yeah, very much like yourself, Johannes, a lot of my sort of prep time is spent sort of like wandering through these different like inspirational materials, waiting for something to strike.
Yep. Sometimes that, like, just to give an idea of what that actually means, it might mean that I'm reading all my Mummy books, the actual published books that I have, or it might mean that I'm scrolling through Pinterest for 4 hours looking at pictures. So or like looking at some Wikipedia thing connected to whatever I'm thinking about, and like several hours later, I'm finding myself reading about nuclear fission, the the science behind nuclear fission on Wikipedia. So for me, it's a very random sort of way to go about it, I guess. But that's sort of something I do by just instinct. I just sort of like cast my net wide and go where I may.
Yeah, it's a bit like that gold panning, isn't it? You scoop up a load of dirt and then you sieve it and sieve it and sieve it until you get the little gold nuggets. And I mean, I did very much the same when I was running Vampire. I mean, when I was like, oh, you're having a big meeting, all the vampires in the city you've contacted, and some you don't know are coming to this meeting to talk about what you're going to do in this situation. I was like, right, okay, I need a bundle of like NPCs. I'm pretty free to go with what I want, besides the fact they're mostly younger vampires. So yeah, I just spent ages on Pinterest, like, for people who've drawn various different vampires, just looking at pictures and going like, oh, which of these pictures look interesting? Right, I'll grab a handful of those. Right, what sort of vampire does it suggest to me? So like, oh yeah, we had the Set-Eyed, who was a bit of a sort of like Harley Quinn-esque looking woman, but like in a smart business suit. So I was like, right, okay, so she's obviously got like a good business head, but, you know, maybe like underneath all of that, she's got that sort of religious like fervour that most of the Setites have. And I spun the entire NPC off that one picture, and likewise for a lot of the others. Okay, so just as a broad sort of ballpark figure, then obviously we know it varies, and like we say, we spend a lot of time sort of looking at inspiration. Of like, let's say you're running a weekly game, the sort of the holy grail of RPGs. On a weekly game, how much time in a week would you spend on prep, roughly?
Varies wildly depending on my mood. Sometimes I'll try and spend time on it, but it's barely more than an hour, and other times I'll spend like a day, maybe two, working on a single adventure.
I mean, I think for me, the way I tend to try and organise my prep is that my sort of energy levels and enthusiasm are sort of at a height either just after I've finished the previous session or sort of on the day or two leading up to the next session. Because obviously we've all got like real life stuff and work and whatnot in between that demands your attention. So I tend to try and wrap up anything and update my notes from the previous session. So like, as soon as I can afterwards, because like my energy's still high, I'm still sort of like buzzing from the session. And then when I sort of start ramping up again, like a day or two before, and I'm like, all right, I'm really looking forward to the next session, can't wait to get running it, I look over those notes I've made, see if I've had any like fresh ideas as I've been looking at various inspirational material in the meantime when I've had chance. So I sort of do like two big bursts of prep, like just after the previous session and just before the next one. That's when I tend to do most of mine.
Yeah. I think the answer is always going to be, it varies quite a bit, especially these times when, well, we've all got a whole bunch of stuff going on during the week. Maybe not so much on the weekend because of certain things, but
yeah,
unless it's gaming over the internet. But I think overall, like a rough average might probably be somewhere around 4 hours. Of course, that's not 4 hours of me sitting down writing notes in prose. That's
yes.
not what it is. It's going to be a combination of me reading books, just sitting and daydreaming, and then a furious hour and a half before the game starts of just like frantically getting at least the 3 bullet points down and sort of pruning my like tree of daydreams at the point in the time. But yeah, I guess that's roughly the amount I would probably say. But of course, the actual amount and the intensity varies quite a bit. Of course, also depending on if you already know what your next thing is going to be, which, as we discussed previously, you can ascertain by asking the players like what they want to do. And if it's a longer running game, you might just have everything you need already, and you do 0 hours of prep because you already have all the detail you need.
Yeah, I think it can also vary depending on like what your particular strengths are and what bits of the prep you personally find very appealing. So I do a fair bit of my prep using like Foundry VTT, and I'm always sort of like keeping you guys in the game like, up to date with what I'm doing. But that's because I enjoy the process of like logging the stuff on the software and like using the VTT software, so that really appeals to me. So I find it easier to sort of like get my enthusiasm up. Like I go, oh yeah, I need to update this bit of equipment for someone, and I'll go on and I'll just like update something, and then I think, oh well, while I'm on, I'll just do this little bit and this little bit, and there are a few things I need to do with this map, and then I tend to end up doing like a couple of hours prep from there. Whereas I think if I didn't enjoy the actual process of using the virtual tabletop so much, I probably wouldn't do the prep in the same way and in the same fashion. Okay, so guys, we've talked about how much prep we do, like what sorts of prep we do. Are there any particular tools or methods that you find particularly useful to help when you're doing your prep work for a game? I'm going to start with one of like my old favourites. You won't be able to see this on the podcast, but I'm taking out a nice fresh pack of index cards. You can hear the cellophane there. That's the sound of a nice fresh pack. Not even been opened yet. It's that new record card smell. Hannah bought me these the other day. That's how much prep I do. Like, my wife sees a stationery on offer in our local supermarket and is like, I'll get John some index cards. He loves index cards. So
affecting the local economy. But
that's it. And I think that's my... that's a holdover for me personally from when I used to run more in-person games when I had more space, because I'd write distinct like, little bits, whether it's an NPC, a location, or whatever, on index cards. I could lay them all out in front of me, and it's like if you've got a location and you know a particular NPC's gone there, you can just slide the NPC card under the location card. Whereas I don't tend to use them that much now in the same way, because I've not got the space to spread them out because most of my games are online. The VTTs replace that, but they are still handy to have a pack there. So if someone comes up with a quick note, I can just grab a pen, scribble it down, put it to one side, and I can copy it up onto the virtual tabletop later.
So I like Excel spreadsheets. You've got all the different pages that you can have different notes on, and you can just make a big load of charts, who's who, what's what, basic like mechanics that you do actually need.
I don't know.
A copy of each of the player characters' sheets, all of that stuff, one document, there it is.
I don't know. You never catch me using Excel spreadsheets for prep. I say
What's that on your computer then?
I say as I'm showing Hannah my like 6 worksheet session summary Excel sheet for the Old School Essentials game.
Yeah, I've got it's not index cards, but the shape is roughly the same. It's just note paper for me that I have on my desk to quickly put down some thoughts, which I did here. Well, you were trying to ask me a question. I'm just dreaming about some point I was trying to make. That's my first course to put something on paper and then refine it later. And I think that's whatever it is that I'm trying to do, it works similarly. I've used Google Docs before. You're just text processing stuff. I'll write down things there. I found that I did quite a lot of work with Google Docs when it came to the start of the number game that I ran. So I did the world prep, wrote all my ideas down there. But I find that ultimately I'm not going to use a lot of that after the game has started. The train has left the station. I don't really need to refer to a lot of that afterwards. And what I would then do is work in... I've run my games, online games, mostly in Roll20.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to be said for that platform, but at least for the moment, it still allows me to give some notes there. And it's been fairly useful for me, my purposes, and what I need. Though we've been playing with Foundry lately with John. That also seems to be fairly good. I'm not sure about how well it works with notes because I've never used it myself in that capacity.
It's pretty good with notes. There's a lot more sort of organisational functionality as far as I'm concerned, but it works in a vaguely similar way to Roll20.
Yeah, it's certainly the player experience has the same kind of like ideas going as Roll20 does. But for me, I think the ultimate place where I tend to put my notes these days, whether I'm originally writing them down on my paper, putting in a note on my phone, or writing them in Google Doc, the end result is going to inevitably end in Roll20 as a handout that I'm using to keep my sort of running notes on things. So that's how it works for me. Now, I've also used Excel. So that's a very good tool for specific kinds of purposes.
Yeah.
Here.
I mean, I think when you sort of boil it down to basics, the absolute sort of minimum in terms of like tools that are helpful is a pen that you're comfortable with writing with and a notepad or something like that. And I mean, your sort of notepad window on the computer is just like a sort of electronic version of that, isn't it, really?
I did use pen and paper a lot more before I got hand injuries and pen holding became an issue.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, because like my memory is like fairly poor on certain things, I've found it quite frustrating in the past where I'd be doing something else and I'd have an idea and I'd be like, right, I must remember that. Then like later on that evening, I'd sit down and I'd be like, I know I had a really good idea for my game, but I cannot think of what it is. And sometimes that'd come back to me, other times it'd just disappear and it was lost. Whereas, especially at the minute where I'm mostly working from home, but if I was at work and I had an idea as well, I've got post-its in my desk at work. I can just quickly scribble it down on a post-it, and just being able to like capture something immediately, even if it's just 1 or 2 words, I can take that post-it, put it in my pocket. Later on when I get home, I go, oh, what was that idea? And it's there. I've not lost it. In terms of other tools, like I say, I'm a big fan of random tables and random charts, just as an idea generator, if nothing else. I've got books and books of those. But even if you don't want to buy books of them, if you get on the internet, there is a plethora of them available. I would also say, as we mentioned, like Pinterest, Google image search, something that gives you like a nice sort of visual reference you can sort of inspire. I mean, you can go on Pinterest, type, like, let's say you're trying to come up with what a skyscraper looks like in your session. You can go on, type in skyscraper in Pinterest, you get a million different images. You can just cycle through them until you find something that speaks to you, and you can use that as a handout or just to like give you an idea to help reference what things look like. And likewise, Google image search as well. So can you guys think of any other tools that you find particularly useful while you're prepping? Or obviously we've referenced
The right background noise.
Yes. Yeah.
And it can be different background noise depending on what story it is, what game it is, what kind of a theme you want to go with that game. But something that's just enough to help you concentrate in the same way that like homework at school needed the right background noise.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I also find useful with the VTT, because I'll quite often have Foundry open on one monitor while I'm doing stuff on the other. And because I've got various maps, like the main hex map for the campaign, set up with like a tune playing in the background, and like 'cause it's an Arctic climate, there's like wind whistling in the background, having that sort of running with that sort of sound going on, sort of, because it's music I associate with the game, helps me get into that sort of mindset.
Yeah, while I've been doing the Star Trek game, I've listened to a lot of Isaac Arthur's podcast, where he's talking about like sci-fi technological stuff. He's got quite a good sort of gentle, dreamy background music, and it's sort of, you can tune it in and out sort of thing, but he is talking about things that are interesting for the game.
I mean,
Get what I mean?
What I'm doing in a similar vein, when I'm doing like World of Darkness or a sort of horror game, there's quite a lot of YouTube channels online where there's people reading out various like now public domain like horror works and ghost stories and stuff like that. And quite often I'll just have one of those on in the background, not because I'm so much pulling from the story, although sometimes I do, but because it gets you into that mindset. You know, like if I was running a detective story or a noir story, I might have like a sort of film noir story on in the background, or like a sort of Sam Spade style like film on in YouTube or whatever, just to sort of get me in that mindset of the game I'm going to be running.
Yeah. One of the things that I've found quite useful is, according to the same sort of principles here, immersing yourself in the kind of other media, non-game media, and maybe even games. So like if you're trying to run a sci-fi game, maybe read other sci-fi games as well, other than the one that you're running. You can steal good ideas from other games, which is, after all, a large part of the craft that we're talking about here.
Definitely.
You take stuff, you repurpose it, and you make it your own, and you run with it. And I think definitely for me, good part of getting into the mind space is just having a lot of similar things that I can sort of touch on at the same time. So if I'm trying to run a mummy game or a vampire game, I'll try and search out media with those elements in it, and then sort of enjoy that on its own. But then I'll have that to dissect later when I get into my lab.
Okay, so to round up, guys, do we think there is such a thing as too much prep? And if so, how much is too much?
when you're not enjoying it anymore. I think I think these are probably Kevin Crawford's words. But I think if you're doing prep and you're not using it for your next session, but you're still enjoying it, yeah, okay, that's fine. That's for you to enjoy.
Yeah.
If you're not using it in your next session and you're no longer enjoying it, stop doing it. That's kind of the general, very vague limit, but still, that's kind of the idea that I have.
Yeah, I think that's true, because if you're doing loads of extra prep and, like, say, some of it's not going to get used, but you're enjoying doing it, it's not going to detract from your game. That's absolutely fine. But I think if you get to the stage, and I've had this, like, I mean, a lot of years and years ago now, but where you get to the stage where you're doing so much prep that it's not going to get used, and you're almost sort of like dreading having to do the prep for a game, that's when you need to, like, take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've definitely been there myself. More in the earlier years, when you don't have the experience, you don't exactly know how things will play out, so you try and plan for everything, and that is exhausting. And yeah,
I think certainly, I know I started with a mindset of similar to what you're talking about, that, like, if you need a certain amount of prep to do a game, then it follows that more prep must automatically be better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which obviously we know now, with sort of like years of gaming experience, that that's not always the case. Mm-hmm. More sort of usable and appropriate prep is good, but if it's just prep that you're not going to use and you're not enjoy doing it, just don't do it.
Yeah,
do what you need to and what you enjoy doing, and the rest you can worry about later on.
And honestly, if you've not got round to doing the prep for your game, there's nothing wrong with telling your players that and saying, can we just have a chat this week? I can't think of any player group that would get angry at a GM who does that just now and then.
I mean, I've done it a few times with various games. I certainly like the White Star game, where obviously before the pandemic, where I've been working flat out all week. Mm-hmm. I've not really had time to do any prep. I've been pretty exhausted from work every day of the week, and I still run a session. But I've just said to the guys at the start, I'll level with you, I've not had anywhere near enough time to prep this session as I'd like, but let's just see where we go. And most players, as long as you say that and you let them know, they're going to give you a bit of leeway, cut you a bit of slack, because at least they're getting a game out of it.
Yep, and ideally they will have sympathy for you, and also then put in effort to make the thing work from their respective place as well. So like I've been in in these sessions where, John, you've rocked up and like, I've worked like 1,000 hours this week and I didn't get to do what I wanted to. I think everyone's always been quite excited to get to the game anyway, and that also, I think probably a lot of the thing that we're talking about here is trust as well. You trusting that your players are not gonna sort of, I don't know, like mistreat you because of that, because you say that, I don't have all my ducks in order this week, and also you trusting the players that they're gonna sort of know how to play regardless.
I mean, I think it's the benefit of sort of like being upfront with things like that, where if you just say to people like, I've not got enough prep, and the players obviously they want to get an enjoyable game, you want an enjoyable game as a GM. If you didn't mention that and you were maybe fumbling over a few things, the players might be like, what's going on here? Like, what's happening? Whereas if you say up front, I've not really had much time to prep, and occasionally you're like, just give me a minute, guys. They're going to be like, he's not had time to prep. No problems. And there's a number of ways you can get around that. Obviously, you could like you could like do a little bit of prep or like work a little bit up while the players are having like a sort of social scene, or you could hand over to one of the players and say, oh, what does your character think about what's going on so far? And while they're discussing that, or doing like a little sort of like party around a campfire scene, you can sort of like make a few notes. But I think most players would rather have a game where the GM's a little bit underprepared, but they're still putting the effort in, they're still trying to run the game, than have to cancel the game.
Yeah, and also this just hit me now. It's a golden opportunity for you to throw questions of extreme import at the players. Let them decide how things work that time. It will lead to amazing things. It might not be their cup of tea, in which case maybe like ask them, is this something you'd be interested in? But it's when I've been on both sides of that, I've been underprepared and asked people to sort of, what do you think this should be? And I've also been the one to answer that question, and it's been great most cases.
I mean, we've had this a few times in the Smoke and Snow Old School Essentials campaign, where, for instance, when we were talking about your character, like obviously because you're not on your home continent, that was very loosely defined at the start. And with your character, and you're like, oh, I want to come from a bit more of a sort of mercantile sort of place. I was just saying to you, all right, what's this place like? And you came up with a name, you came up with some details, we've expanded on that. And also when the character like Malcolm Harp, who's an elf, bumped into another elf adventurer, and I was like, all right, okay, well, the background of elves has been fairly loosely defined. All right, Robert, how do you envision like elves being organised? And he was like, all right, they're in different sort of clans or tribes, and they have like a totem animal for each different tribe. And that sort of spun off like the whole organisational style of elves in my campaign world. And it's probably not something I would have thought of myself had I not asked. So I think we've probably given people who are listening a bit to chew on there with regards to prep. I think we can basically boil it down to, there's a few useful things that you can use to get your sort of inspirational juices flowing. Don't do more prep than you need to do and that you enjoy. And if in doubt, ask your players what they're going to do.
Yeah, get your players involved in the prep when you can.
Yeah. So, all it remains for me to do is to thank Johannes and Hannah for joining me for this discussion.
Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Always a pleasure. If you want to get in touch with us on the podcast, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can leave us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe. There'll be a link in the description of this show. If you're having problems with SpeakPipe, as a few people have been doing, particularly when using mobile phones, our old Anchor account is still active. You can leave us a voicemail on that. If you just do a search for Anchor Red Dice Diaries, you'll find that. Or you can send us an email, maybe with an audio file attached if you want, to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. And until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and whenever you're playing, have fun.
Bye.
Bye.